Hello, and welcome back to Literally Literary. If this is your first time joining us, be sure to check out our previous episodes. This episode, we will begin our discussion on Coatlicue Girl by Gris Muñoz. Last episode, we were able to interview Maurice Carlos Ruffin on his debut novel. This episode, we will begin our discussion on Coatlicue Girl, focusing on the major themes, ideas, and connections we've made.
It's good to hear you all again, and you listeners out there. Hope you all are doing well during these times. There's a lot of things happening out there, and we put out a statement on social media as a statement, in regard to how we, us three in the podcast, and backed by the Mountain Foundation and the Humanities Collaborative, are very much appalled by what has happened, and are very much conscious of the need for Black voices, and so y'all can check out the full statement. And we had just finished Maurice Ruffin's debut novel, so this is our book for June, and I myself had never heard of Gris, so we want to talk. Richie here wants to talk about Gris Muñoz, the writer, and give some background, and then talk about a little bit about the book before we dive into it in our next episode.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you guys for tuning in. It is a real pleasure to be able to be discussing the work of a fronteriza writer. Especially one that I'm lucky enough to know and have experienced her growing up in the scene, in the past decade or so of being involved in the literary scene here in El Paso. That's public readings and really the community, the kind of stuff that she talks about in her book. Now Coatlicue Girl is a text that has been in the works for quite a while. In fact, she'll mention, I think it was up to like 9 years in the making. So it involves stories and poems that she's been working on for a while. And if you guys want to learn more about that, I definitely encourage you guys to reach out to her. You can contact her and buy. I think you can get a copy of the book at her website, grismunoz.com. And so I'm happy to embark on this adventure and eventually get to have her as a guest on the show. She's a very powerful poet in my eyes, powerful writer. She, has influenced me in many ways. Some of my first poetry readings, I was kind of drawn to her energy, which I think a lot of people are. So Gris is a performance poet. I think in her bio it mentions she's a frontera poet, performer, and essayist. What I remember a lot from is, I think one of the first things that I've experienced with her was a reading we did in Segundo Barrio, and kind of, when we talk about the people, the gente, it's our people here in El Paso of Mexican American, Chicano, indigenous descent, and so I was involved with a couple of events where I was trying to learn more about my identity as someone who identifies as Chicano. One of those events is we got to perform our poetry in Segundo Barrio in a neighborhood park for the people, and have a ritual, a ceremony, and I think that was really cool. And a little later on, I was able to attend a sweat with some of the community members. I think it's a community that respects the elders, people who have had their struggles and fights and spiritual awakenings. And so I'll just always kind of remember these things with her. She's also, of course, I think she gets invited to read and perform at a lot of community and cultural events. In this book, you see her voice, right? That talks a little bit about the cultures you see here in the borderland, Paso, Juarez, people of Mexican and also indigenous descent. You see it obviously in the title, which is kind of a reference to a Nahuatl, Coatlicue Girl. And I believe even Luis Alberto Urea in his forward refers to her as Donantzin, which is the earth goddess. And so a couple more things. I don't want to talk too long because I think we'll learn about her as we dive into the book and read the poems and stories. You get to hear a lot about her, but I mentioned that she's a powerhouse of a poet. I think she's definitely one of the most memorable for a lot of people in the sense that she takes it all on stage. She leaves it all on the stage. She puts her emotion, she puts all of herself into it, and that translates into just this awesome energy on stage that causes people to just stop what they're doing in their tracks and listen. And that's a very important power, talent, or as she would say, a medicine. If you guys want to learn a little bit more about her book and her journey, I encourage you guys to check out. She did a book release in April for this book. I know that she had planned a big one, but of course, because of this pandemic and COVID-19, that was impossible. So a lot of us have had to adapt, and so we've had a lot of online readings. Many of the poets we've had on the show already have been doing workshops and been involved with readings. So she teamed up with Mujeres de Maíz. Totally encourage you guys to check them out. They're a great group as well. And I think in late April for Poetry Month, she had an online release, and you can actually catch that on YouTube. You can just look up Mujeres de Maíz, Gris Muñoz book release, Coatlicue Girl. And that one was really cool because I think something that's really important about Gris is she also involves community members and people that I think she looks up to. And so for the release, she had other poets give them a shout out, Rios de la Luz, as well as Irene Lara Silva. They had some readings, and she even had a DJ from San Diego, DJ Malavida. She had some really cool music playing, some cumbias and kind of mix of cumbias. And of course, Gris read and talked a little bit about her story. Um, that's kind of one of the benefits, I guess, of doing these things online, and it's out there now, documented, and you can check that out. And really kind of going to the book before I leave off on this, just because I know I'm already talking way too much. Is she incorporates her community, right? I talked about in the reading, but something that I find significant is that this is also a collaboration with artwork from Los Dos, right? And Los Dos, they're a border art collective based out of here in Juarez and El Paso. They're internationally known. You can just look them up. Los Dos. It is actually a husband and wife duo, Ramon and Christian Cardenas, and they have murals posted all over the cities. And if you have a chance to look them up, I definitely encourage you to check them out. They have such a unique flavor. I know when Rage Against the Machine was coming into town, they were actually the artists who were in some of the posters that showed up around town. And they also did artwork for my friend Ruby Orozco Santos. Ruby published a book last year called Inventos Míos, which she won through a grant through the city. And Inventos Míos is also, it's a bilingual collection of poetry and prose, and it talks about this history, this process called nixtamalization of preparing masa and corn, and highly recommended. Ruby did such a great job with that, and that also features artwork from Los Dos. So what I'm kind of getting at here is it's really beautiful to see all these collaborations of artists and writers here in the frontera that we're doing stuff together and uplifting one another. And so, yeah, I'm ready to dive into Gris's book. I'm going to go ahead and put the pause button on for now, but what's up with you guys? I know that this is from Flower Song Press, and you guys have some stuff to mention about them.
Yeah, thank you, Richie. And I didn't think you talked a lot at all. We really appreciate giving us that context, because neither I nor Vanessa know Gris personally. And so there was a lot to digest, honestly. But, I think just from reading her work, like you said, what really resonated to me is she's such a powerful, unique voice. And like you said, it's the work itself is very unique because of how it mixes up the genres. And so we'll get into that. But going back to what you mentioned about the publisher, so Flower Song Press, Flower Song Books, formerly known. I want to give a shout out. Vanessa and I both met Edward Vidaurre, who's the editor in chief of the press, and then it was founded by David Bowles, who's another big writer and the voice who people might know not necessarily just from his work, but also he is very outspoken about Dignidad Literaria. He's one of the leaders, along with Miriam Gurba, on that. As far as what happened with that offer in American Dirt, which we've talked about before in this podcast. So we met Edward at Texas Book Festival, and then you, Vanessa, met him also at AWP.
Yes. So at the Texas Book Festival, I was kind of just introduced to him through another writer, Sergio Troncoso. And he was a really nice guy. So, and then at AWP, I actually got to hear him read some of his work, which was amazing. He's really a great writer.
Yeah, he was impressive as a performer. This was at the River Runs Through Us event that was partially hosted by Border Senses.
Right.
Which is a local organization that you two are a part of, right? In some way?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So, I want to give a shout out to the press because they've been supportive of us. And I think it's important right now, especially, but always, support independent small presses. They're definitely one of them. And like you said, Vanessa, I want to give thanks to Sergio for introducing us in the first place. This is an amazing work that we really want to dive into in the next episode. But just like we do for other episodes, right now for you listeners, we wanted to give you all a preview of this book, especially since right now because of COVID, there might be a delay in you being able to pick up a copy, as I always like to say.
I also wanted to go back to something that Richie mentioned about the community involvement that came into helping create this book. I think that's something that we talk about a lot, especially with a lot of these books. Like it takes a community. They involve as many people in their community as they can in order to help lift their own communities. So I think that that's really important and great that she was able to incorporate Los Dos in the artwork for the book.
I agree. Yeah, that's a really good point, Vanessa. I know you, Richie. You've asked that of the people, the writers that we've interviewed. Whether it's Jose or Maurice Ruffin. Last time. So yeah, I think this is a complex work, and we want to do it justice. So did you all have anything else to say about the background and context before we kind of give a little taste of what to find inside?
This is obviously a new release, and it was complicated a little bit because of COVID-19 and what's been happening. But something that I thought was really refreshing is how much support she actually has received for this book. And like I mentioned, I think over the years she's received a lot of support from people over the years. And you've also seen this book shapeshift into so many different forms. I know we'll have her on as a guest eventually, but she can talk about how, at one point she, essentially this wasn't going to be a hybrid book. she wanted to publish like maybe one book of poems, another one short stories. But over time, she realized that living on the border, it's full of hybridity, and so she decided the voice might be more genuine to kind of just put these stories together. And I'll let her expand on that a little bit more in the future when we have her on the show. But it was really fun to see online people pre-order the book through her, and so she would kind of update people where she would receive shipments from the press, and she would send them out to people who ordered through her, and she would of course write a little note for them. So I have a special edition where she wrote a really nice message for me and signed it. That's always great to have. I encourage you guys, if you have an opportunity, reach out to her and see if she'll sign your book.
You make a really good point about supporting writers, and it brings to mind a conversation people are having online about publishers and how much disparity there is between writers of color, and white, especially male or cis writers, in other words, straight. So I think, it's part of that broader conversation that we need to have. And I think I'm very glad that people are having it, disclosing those amounts, because it is another injustice that we need to address, in terms of how little writers of color, whether they're indigenous or Black or Chicana in the case of Gris. So yeah, I just wanted to mention that.
Mm-hmm. And also something that I think is one of the points of this podcast is the importance of supporting living authors, contemporary authors. When we go to AWP, there's so many panels on the significance, the importance to teach contemporary authors, because they're talking about stuff that's important to us and that's relevant. We love the classics, but also we can definitely welcome in new voices, especially ones that maybe haven't been or maybe have been underrepresented in literature.
Exactly. And there's a great kind of movement on that. I mean, there's a lot of them. There's Disrupt Text by Lorena Germán, whom I met as NCT and is a great colleague doing very important work. But there's also Teach Living Poets with Melissa, who I also met at NCT. And she emphasizes that, we do need to teach living writers, not just because they're, talking about the here and now, but like you said, the ability to interact with them, I think, is something that social media is making more accessible. And especially right now, like you said, because of these readings that are taking place online, so they're a lot more accessible.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So you all ready to, Vanessa, you ready to kind of give the readers of before we even get to the specific like structure and so forth, did you want to start with connections maybe to other texts?
Sure. Well, as far as like the books that we've talked about on the podcast, I definitely made connections with Sabrina and Karina, and I also made some connections with Everything Begins and Ends at the Kentucky Club.
Could you explain to the listeners how so?
Yeah. Well, particularly Everything Begins and Ends at the Kentucky Club, because it is another book that we're able to talk about that takes place here in our community. So it mentions places like Sunset Heights, Central El Paso, that we are able to picture ourselves because they're places that we go to regularly, I guess.
Yeah.
And then with Sabrina and Karina, I think the overall perspective, I guess, in the sense that it is woman-centered. So we get a lot of the perspective of a Chicana, and the things that she's going through and dealing with, whether it be her culture or the experiences she has in public, family, generational type of conflicts as well.
Yeah. And, you've mentioned the setting, right? El Paso. And I know, with Jose Olivares, we talked about, one of his poems that mentions it, Mexican-American disambiguation, or it might have been gentrification, but there's also a Black Klansman, at least partially, Ron Stallworth's memoir of being an undercover KKK member, and how he himself, after he ended up retiring here, and now he lives here. So those are some great connections.
What about in terms of like Chicana literature? I know you've mentioned before some of the connections that you saw as well.
Oh yeah. So outside of the books that we've talked about, I mean, you mentioned Vanessa, Sabrina, and Karina, and I see a lot of what it means to be Chicana. As I think Kali identifies, and I think she also identifies as indigenous or of indigenous ancestry. But of course, there's also Jose Olivares and Ben Saenz, who have Chicano influences. But outside of that, to me, I see in Gris's work, I see a lot of Gloria Anzaldúa, who's one of my heroes. She is a Chicana feminist, and if anyone out there hasn't read her, I really recommend Borderlands La Frontera, her magnum opus. And it's very similar, not just in terms of what it means to be a queer Chicana, but also in terms of its structure. Because in that work she also mixes a lot of prose and poetry, and like you said, in the text itself. Along with Gloria, and Gloria also explores a lot of indigeneity, and kind of interrogates that, and she has this whole concept of neplanta and shadow beast, is it? And so a lot of different identities. There's also Sandra Cisneros that comes to mind, whether it's Women Howling Creek, the same, or House of Mangrove Street. It's I see imprints and vestiges of that, and influences of that in Gris's book.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. I definitely saw, and also, by the way, if you guys are listening, and if you're barely hearing of Gloria Anzaldúa or any of the authors that are mentioned, definitely recommend hitting them up. I particularly think that Anzaldúa is required reading. If you live in the borderlands, you should definitely own a copy. They talk about when you meet people and like looking at their bookshelf. I always kind of like, that's always plus points for me, seeing that one on someone's bookshelf. And because it also deals, like you mentioned, a lot with identities, the fractured or even defragmentation, I think is a word that might be used, and I think is even used in Coatlicue Girl, of like just personal identity and memory and experiences.
Yeah. And so it's very similar in that regard to Maurice's book, We Cast a Shadow, and that like he said in the interview, right? I mean, he's making an homage to this work, but also extending to their work, but also building from it. And I think it's very fascinating when writers do that, and we can actually talk to them about it, because of course, living in the digital age that we do now. I mean, it's like I said, it's even though, some would say that, and many writers say this, that the text should speak for itself. I think, we can gain a lot more appreciation and understanding of the text by talking to the writer. So I think that's just very valuable.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Did y'all see other connections?
Well, just without really diving into it, I know, the artwork from Los Dos is really important, and I know we'll get into it more specifically as we tackle the pieces in the book. But even just looking at the cover, I'm looking at the shirt this character is wearing, which seems to kind of recall the images of the Zapatistas in Mexico, right? The Army of National Liberation, which kind of often deals with kind of far left socialist politics, as far as I, my limited knowledge, but I definitely think that's significant in the spirit of the book as well.
Yeah, that's a good point, Richie. And we're talking about this pre-show, but is that artwork similar also to the artwork that Rage Against the Machine used in the reunion show that they were going to play here?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Los Dos did the artwork for the posters. I think they were posted like along a food city or something like that. But
Oh yeah,
yeah. So when they announced their tour, starting in El Paso, yeah, that was artwork by Los Dos, and it does definitely recall that imagery as well.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. You mentioned the Zapatistas, and like you said, right, the far left, and I think right now, the far left is very much becoming part of the more mainstream conversation. You don't, at least in my day, you don't see that. You haven't seen that much often. So, it reminds me of their leader, Subcomandante Marcos. And I remember when I would teach the Chicanx Lit class at MSU that I would read one of Subcomandante Marcos's poems, because he was a writer too. He is a writer. He talks a lot about expressing solidarity with the other. He's very much emphasize. He's really big on that. Along with also speaking up, like you said, with Chiapas and indigenous rights, where I think it's important to call out Mexican racism and bigotry and xenophobia against its own indigenous population, and also very much against a lot of the Central American migrants right now who arrived because of the caravan and are having to remain in Mexico because of our current president's immigration policies.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think Gris is very much in line with understanding, I think, her ancestry. I think there's a section in the book where, I mean, a lot of it's spiritual as well, in which she refers to her ancestors and maybe seeing like spirits. I know there's a section where she like sees the spirits of Apache warriors driving down a stretch of highway, and I can't wait to talk about that stuff a little bit more in future episodes. But I think a huge part of that is also she asked her dad about it, and he kind of like rejected that part of, he didn't, to the narrator of that piece. I think she had to find out through her grandmother that her ancestry, came from Apache, but she was like wondering why her father refused to acknowledge that part. So it's something we do see a lot of here.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of that, Richie, Vanessa, did you want to give the readers just a basic overview, maybe thematic, or just kind of thinking about the structure that we've referenced, like its hybrid nature?
Do you mean like what I was talking about earlier?
Yeah.
Okay. So this book is really interesting because it's the first book that we're doing that has entire pieces in Spanish. Like we've read other books for the podcast that have words and phrases that are in Spanish or oh my goodness, Tagalog. But this one has entire pieces that are in Spanish. So I'm definitely excited to talk about those.
Yeah, right from the cover, you learned that these are both poems and stories. And you, Richie, mentioned those artwork. And I think this is what makes this work part of one of the main reasons why this work is at the same time very unique, even though it does pay homage to indigenous culture, elevating indigenous identity and what it means to be Chicana and what it means to be queer. But what about like thematic points and references, things that you all see from the text? We've kind of talked about it already, but just kind of, we've talked about, you mentioned, Richie, the spirituality that kind of is interspersed throughout the work.
Yeah, and I think also earlier Vanessa mentioned kind of what it means to be a woman, and I think she brings up kind of the gaze of men, the dangerous gaze of men. In some sections, you see some aspects of that. You also kind of have maybe some economic struggle in there, and at some points there's a reference to being a single mother and what that entails.
Yeah, I mean, it reminded me a lot there, Richie, of Sabrina and Karina more than anything, because I think, because even with Ben Signs, now that I remember it, like a lot of the characters there were like middle class, or upper class even. But, I think just like with Sabrina and Karina, these are characters who are very relatable, very much not bourgeoisie, and I think, very down to earth in that regard, and it's kind of, I think, part and parcel also of the border. Our border community here in El Paso and Juarez is a low-income community, and I think it's important that we do what we can to kind of bring that to a spotlight. We're one of the safest communities, but also we're a community that does suffer a lot, especially right now because of the pandemic, as I'm sure other communities are also impacted by it. But yeah, that's definitely one of the things that stood out to me as well.
You could even maybe, obviously identity is a huge theme, and things like self-love and like kind of even dealing with a little bit of self-hate at some points and learning to like love those parts of yourself that at first you had rejected. I know there's a pretty heavy poem where when she's younger, she rejected kind of her indigenous attributes, her physical attributes, like her nose. And she talks about trying to change that about herself, but realizing later on that was a huge part of her.
I think also there's a little bit of a like a generational gap. Like she compares the way that she thinks to the way her parents and her grandparents think in some of these pieces, I think.
That reminds me of I'm Not Your Perfect Mexican Daughter, because there was that huge gap,
Yeah. I also thought of Poet X when Richie said about the gaze of men. I kind of thought of like stoop sitting.
Yeah. And then you, Richie, mentioned also in the background for Gris, for biographical background, performance, and performance is also a big part of poetics.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned stoop sitting, because in a way, I almost even think of in the beginning of this book, you have the short story Buron, which is almost like a inverse of that, where she's the one sitting down and observing what's happening across the street at the grocery store from her. And I can't wait to talk about that one next episode. But yeah.
There's also like you said, Richie, how a lot of these characters are suffering, they're impoverished, they're struggling, single moms or what have you. But there's also what drew me a lot into the text was, one of the stories, there's reference to contamination, in the water. And, so I think that is a very important conversation to have in relation to environmental justice. It's one of the things that I think ties in a lot of what we're seeing, because you have, industries and corporations, and a lot of times, colluding with the local government or the state, that end up polluting the waters. They end up polluting the air. And they do so at the behest of the communities of color.
Yeah, the poor communities in town.
Yeah. So that was another thing that, we haven't really seen much before in the text that we've talked about. And that, as we're having this conversation, and doing a lot of listening of, racial justice, I think it goes hand in hand with environmental justice because of how it is targeted against, whether it's the Black community, the Latinx community, and especially, indigenous communities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you could find Gris part of those fights. They're very much alive today in El Paso. There's some really hot button topics. One of the things that's been fought is, the bus terminal by Bowie High School, which and there's some junk and salvage yards that are contributing to pollution levels that, of course, these communities are inhaling. It makes me think of as well of El Paso history, Asarco, as well, which contaminated the soil and the area for so long, in which the residents developed cancers and lifelong issues, health issues. And it is it's environmental justice. It's also one that deals with economic injustice, in that it's often the poor communities in our city that are affected by this. You wouldn't see these bus terminals like set up by Franklin High School, and it's something that I think as a writer, you draw attention to that as well in your community. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, I think it's one of my personal passions, and you mentioned the economic connection as well, and I think that's absolutely true. There's a lot of intersectionality with environmental justice. The environmental movement itself, for a lot of its existence, has been very white-centered. Going back decades, of course, but I think it's important to elevate these concerns, and look at it, from what we call a deep ecology perspective, which basically means that, instead of worrying about recycling or worrying about, let's consume less, let's look at the big picture, right? Let's look at how corporations exert all this power over us, and it's where we end up being disenfranchised as well because of voting, and right now as well, I think a lot of these issues are at the forefront. So I'm really glad and buoyed that the protests are going on right now. It gives me a lot of hope, and I am very supportive of what I've seen.
Right. So I mean, for this book of poems and short stories, I think there's a lot of deep moments that you can kind of reach in like a well and pull something out, just like this, and bring up topics worth discussing that are relevant to our people here in the border and all over, really.
Yeah, and going back, and then also, speaking of that, just to kind of flesh it out more, you mentioned, Vanessa, also that some of the poems are in Spanish, and it also goes a little bit into the need for more for works that are bilingual, for works that embrace that dual language or even trilingual nature. You could argue this one is as well, because as you mentioned, right, it uses the Aztec tongue of Tlacual, and I think that's very important in terms of disrupting that canon and making sure that publishers are open to these kinds of books, right? Instead of thinking that, well, no, you have to make your characters more white, or you have to translate that to the reader.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think there's a lot that we're going to go into in the next couple of episodes, and it's going to be a privilege to be able to talk to her, and I'm very grateful that you know her, Richie, and you've kept in touch with her. So was there anything else that you all wanted to spotlight?
For now, there's a couple other things that I haven't mentioned yet, but I'd like to kind of bring up when we do have her on as a guest. But I do think she has a pretty interesting aspect of actually why she included poems in Spanish. I think so many years ago, when she first started doing a lot of writing, she didn't have that many poems in Spanish. But if I forget, you guys have to remind me or you can ask herself about that. It actually did have to deal with her reading, doing a reading performance in public, and community response. So, but I'll leave that as kind of like maybe a teaser for future episodes.
Cool. Well, Gris, as someone who is a queer Chicana of Apache descent, has with us a book that you readers out there, you really do need to pick up, and just learn. I mean, not just learning about her, what she's talking about, her culture, and the different characters' backgrounds, and the different themes that we've talked about, the struggles with identity, but also learning about how all of this comes together, and structurally, we've already talked about this, its hybrid nature. But I mean, maybe this is just a little point, but I thought it was interesting that after Luis Urrea's, who's one of my favorite Chicano writers, who's written, Hummingbird's Daughter and Devil's Highway and other works, is that the acknowledgments come not at the end, but at the beginning. I don't know if you all have seen something like that before, but I thought it was very interesting, and I think it reminds me of when poets at open mics honor a certain poet by reading their work before reading their own. I don't know if that was something that y'all also thought was noticeable, but to me it was.
Yeah, would love to ask her about that.
Yeah.
But I think it does go hand in hand with what we've already discussed about, like, just acknowledging the community around you. and that these are people that were significant in support of her journey towards this book. So I guess for her, I think that's something. Yeah, like you said, I think that was a great analogy of like the poet, reading an open mic. And of course, and also Gris Muñoz has been featured at our open mics before. She's been a featured reader at Bar Open Mic back at the Percolator days. And that was when she had her stage name La Rana.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
that's something I'd love to have her talk about more too.
Cool. Well, I think we'll stop the conversation here. And, for the next episode, we'll be talking about half of the book. So in the meantime, I hope you listeners take care out there. I know, like I said, there's a lot going on, and we want to have this small space, to kind of just think about literature and its relevance, and how, what kind of literature is also, that we need to talk about as well. So,
yeah.
Absolutely. And a quick call to action. If you guys do have a copy, send us questions. We still want to, we have our Instagram page, our Twitter page. If there's anything you want to know about the author or the book, if you have the book and you're reading along, like, we welcome any questions you may have, and we can definitely ask her when she's on the show.
Yeah, good point, Richie.
Thanks for joining us on this week's episode discussing Coatlicue Girl by Gris Muñoz. And if you haven't read it, we hope we inspire you to pick up a copy. Literally Literary is brought to you by the Mellon Foundation through the Humanities Collaborative at EPCC and UTEP. Follow us on Instagram at literallyliterary.ep and on Twitter at literallylitep.